So want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. Today we're going to be discussing Sumo Logic and more specifically Sumo Logic QuickStart. So how do you get you guys up to speed in the understanding of how to use Sumo Logic, some of the features. Today's webinar is going to be a combination of some PowerPoint slides, certainly some in-app demos, and if you guys have questions, if you want to go ahead and post them into the chat window, we can go ahead and try to answer those. So let's go ahead and get started. So here we go. So what are we going to be discussing today? So we're going to be discussing Sumo Logic and more specifically becoming a Sumo Pro user. This information today is going to correspond with our certification level 1. We've recently launched a certification program that currently consists of 3 different levels. Today's class will be level 1, and as you all have registered for this webinar, I'm sure you saw the links to register for the other ones, and we certainly encourage you to do so to expand your Sumo Logic knowledge. What are we going to specifically be talking about over the next hour or so? So these are going to be the 5 steps to becoming a Sumo Pro user, and we're going to discuss these throughout the session today. So how does Sumo Logic help me? You now have Sumo Logic access, and how do you use it to benefit you and make sure that you can go ahead and view that content that's going to be relevant to you? What data is available so I can analyze? Certainly you now have access to the system, and now you need to understand what is there that you can go ahead and look at, and we'll show you some ways to see what data is been essentially loaded for you. How can I search, parse, and analyze my data? So now you have all this data available to you, and you need to go ahead and analyze it. And so we're going to take a look at some of the search mechanisms, some parsing and analyzing query language that will allow you to essentially take your data and slice and dice it to a way that's going to make sense to you and any users that might need to look at that data. How can I monitor my trends and critical events? So certainly we want you to be able to take advantage of Sumo Logic to be able to go ahead and do those type of things, to see trends, look at patterns, and potentially even prediction models and outliers to see what's going on with your trends. And with the monitoring, one of the cool things about Sumo Logic is you have the ability to set up alerts so that you can be notified of events that are taking place when you're not in Sumo Logic. We certainly don't want you to have to be logged in 24/7, staring at a screen, waiting for an event to occur. We'll show you some ways that you can integrate with email or webhooks so you can get a notification when these events occur. And then where do I go from here? So certainly we're going to give you a fair amount of knowledge over the next hour or so. And then, what are the next steps? How do you go ahead and continue and advance your knowledge of Sumo Logic? So let's go ahead and dive in here. There's going to be a corresponding tutorial that has some hands-on exercises that we would encourage you to go through. We'll be looking at most of those today. I'll be kind of covering the tutorial steps, but we would certainly encourage you to go ahead and do this on your own time and actually get the hands-on experience. So this is the content, the information that's going to be necessary to log into those training environments. And I'll show you how you can access this link so you don't have to go ahead and write this down or take a screenshot if you don't need to. Questions. So you're certainly going to have questions after today. We have a very thorough documentation and a community forum that are going to be great for you to get some assistance with answers. So we would encourage you to go ahead and attend or join the community. And you can also have live conversations with our community via Slack. So I'll go ahead and point those out later as well, but did want to just show you where those exist. And then finally, based on the knowledge that we're going to provide you today, this is going to be enough content and information for you to be able to go ahead and take our first exam, so the level 1 exam, Sumo Pro User. As you can see here, this is some of the, on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the preparation, which is going to be the QuickStart webinar, which we're about to do, and the tutorial, which I just referenced a few moments ago. And so this will be a great, opportunity for you to go ahead and prove that you've have that Sumo knowledge experience for yourself and for your organization. So we would certainly encourage you to take the exams at a later time. So let's go ahead and dive in. So how does Sumo Logic help me? You now have this system. How do you get to do something and to take advantage of the service? So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start with a demonstration. So let me go ahead and just switch screens here. And I'm going to actually start with this screen over here. And so what I want to show is a demonstration, and we're going to go through the scenario of using our fictitious company called Travel Logic. And what this organization does is it's a travel agency. So similar to if you go to a website like Expedia or any of those popular sites, and you would go in and you'd book a car, book a flight, compare prices. I think you guys have all experienced that at some point. And that's going to be what the site we're going to use for today's scenario. So I could go in here and start to book a flight and look for hotel and all that. I'm not going to just to save a few moments of time because I'm sure you have all experienced this interface before. But I want to start with a scenario here. So I get a call. I'm an operations individual, and I get a call from someone in upper management, and they said, "Hey, we're getting reports that people cannot check out on Travelogic. As a result, if they can't check out, they can't pay for their tickets, they can't book their travel. Certainly a problem for them and a problem for us as an organization, because if they can't book travel, we don't get paid." So that's certainly a scenario that is going to be a problem for organizations. So at this point, I know this information that people can't check out. So that's the piece of information I know. At the same time, though, I get a Slack message. And what this Slack message is showing me is a monitor alert, and it says critical on travel app, high node CPU. So that's interesting. I know that, or I've received a phone call from somebody that said, hey, people can't check out. So I have that piece of information. And now I have a piece of information that seems that there's a high CPU related to the travel app. And those are the two pieces of information I know. And so now I need to go ahead and start to do some detective work and figure out what's going on and, more importantly, how to resolve it. And so that's where I'm going to go ahead and start to use Sumo Logic to help me. So let me go ahead and switch windows here. And I'm going to jump into my Travelogic operational overview. So at this point, what I'm looking at is a dashboard that I've created that is going to allow me to look at different operational events. And so what we're able to see here, for example, and even if we don't know the technical details on what these things are, just by taking a glance at these, we see reporting nodes, they're certainly reporting, so that's a good sign. And we see these green indicators that there's no errors, and so in this case, green is good. Contrastly, red is bad, and so we see here, we see that the response times are a little bit higher than what we would expect, and more importantly, the checkout service has produced about 4,000 errors in the last 60 minutes. Well, I know I believe there's an issue with the checkout service, and this is kind of confirming that there have been a bunch of errors, or more specifically about 4,000 of them in the last 60 minutes. So this gives me a starting point to start to dig in. And now I want to go ahead and continue digging in and seeing what's going on, and more importantly, can I resolve it? So I'm going to go ahead and click on this icon here, which is going to show in the search. Basically, I'm taking this panel of the dashboard, and I'm just going to expand it out. And so now what I'm looking at are the service details related to our Travelogic website. And so I'm going to go through some of the panels on this dashboard view. So over here, we have our list of our reporting on bookings, and we have our successes and fails. And we see here, things were very successful. At 8:20, people were able to book. 8:30, 8:40, 8:50, so on. And then right about 8:57 or so, our successful bookings dropped, and we have a bunch of fails, which is, well, that seems to be a problem. So we're looking at this occurred at about 8:56. So, okay, that's interesting. At about 8:56, things seem to switch over, so to speak, to going bad. And let's take a look at some other panels here and see if this corroborates our information or helps in any way. If we look at this errors for the last 7 days, we see there were a couple errors a few days ago. We see that there were errors some 3 days ago, some errors yesterday, and then we see there was a space where there were no errors at all over the last 7 days. And then once again, about 8:55 or so, there started to be errors today. So that seems to kind of be in sync with the time. So it looks like maybe about 8:55-ish or so, something went a little wrong, or at least errors started to be reported. If we go ahead and look further down here, errors by node, we're certainly going to go ahead and discuss in a little bit the source name. But if I mouse over these, I can see that there were errors related to the CS team.travel-checkout. So that's interesting. There appears to be errors specifically related to this section. So that's good to know. If I go over here and look at gateway latency, what I have here is essentially a threshold and an outlier graph that's showing me information. And so what I'm able to interpret from this is our gateway latency, was determined to be within a certain threshold range. And as long as it's in that range, it would be considered to be flat, which is good, so that things were humming along as they should be. And then at about 8:55 or so, we see that the gateway latency jumped up, and we see these pink triangles that represent outliers. And so basically, the system was expecting some sort of norm, and then at about 8:55, 8:56, the latency went outside that norm. Okay, that's interesting as well. And then finally, we have our CPU and total memory panel up here. And what we see here is, if we look at this at about, this 8 o'clock, 8:56 time or so, we see a increase or start to see a spike in some of the information in here. And so we know that due to the Slack message I received, that something related to the CPU was high. We don't know why it was high, but we also just know that the two pieces of information seem to occur around the same time. Checkouts fails started to occur, and spikes in CPU usage started to occur as well. So what we're going to do is I'm going to drill into the CPU and total memory, because this is the one piece of information I know where I can start to look at something a little more specifically, since I have that Slack message that helped point me in this direction. So I'm going to go ahead and drill in here. Oop, there we go. Click on that little guy. And so now what I'm looking at is a metrics view that is showing information about CPU and total memory usage. And so right here, we see the CPU information, and we see the memory usage information. And so we see both of these pieces of information within this graph. And so I don't really need to look at the memory usage, because the Slack message I received indicated something was up related to the CPU. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this guy and just essentially turn off or comment off the memory usage, since it's not really relevant for me at this time. And so what I'm looking at now is the CPU usage. And so if we still see those spikes, once again, about this 8:56 time. And so what I want to do is, right now I'm looking at metrics, and I want to go ahead and look to identify why things were going on. With the metrics, those are helping me to identify what was going on, and in this case, what was going on was increased CPU usage. But like I said, I want to see why it was going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to overlay some of my logs, and so I can look at essentially a unified logs and metrics environment. So I'm going to go ahead down here and start to define the logs that I want to take a look at. And if you remember, I was looking at source category, CS team travel checkout. So I'm going to go ahead and start to look at those logs. I'm also going to look more specifically in the logs. Rather than looking at all the logs together, I want to look for errors that occurred within the logs. So I'm going to go ahead and look for the keyword of error, ERROR, and I'm going to hit enter. And what's going to happen now is I'm going to have that unified log and metrics environment that I was just referencing, and I'm going to see the log information up here. So what I'm looking at right now at the very top in this orange bar is essentially a heat map, which is showing the information related to this log information. And so what I see here is, prior to this 8:55 time or so, there were actually no messages that had the string of error in it. However, at about 8:55 or so, then we started to see some errors in our logs. And the orange bar represented up here is kind of color sensitive. So the lighter the color, the less frequent the messages. And that's why there, prior to 8:55, there were actually no messages, and why the bar is white or blank. But as we see here, there start to be an increase in messages. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and look at the logs related to one of these time slices, as we call them. These are essentially 1-minute chunks right now of time. And I'm going to take a look at those logs and see if I can see in the logs why things were haywire, so to speak. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the heat map, the time slice, and I'm going to do a shift click. And that's going to go ahead and open the logs now in the log browser. And so what I'm looking at now is all the errors that occurred with the travel checkout source category. And so this is giving me all these errors. And as I see here, there were about 300 errors during this 1-minute chunk. And so I could see some of these errors here. And if I look at them, I see access denied. I see an error down here related to the SSL service certificate. So that's interesting. I'm seeing the errors, but I'm not seeing what caused them yet. And that's really what's going to be most important to me, and more importantly, going to help me identify how to solve the problem. So I'm going to do two things at this time. The first is I'm going to expand my search out. So rather than just looking for errors, I'm going to look for all the events that occurred in these logs. going with the idea that something caused all these errors, but what caused the error may have not necessarily been an error itself. So I'm just basically expanding my search out. The other thing I want to do is I want to expand my time search out. So right now I'm looking at a 1 minute chunk of time where I know there were errors, but kind of using the same idea with expanding or removing the error string, I want to go ahead and expand my timeout because for this minute segment, I know that there are errors, but I'm looking to see what caused those errors. So I'm going to go ahead and expand my search and look at the last 60 minutes. And so what I'm doing now is I'm basically looking at the logs for the travel checkout source category, which is a naming convention that's used for to identify the data. And now I'm able to view all the logs that occurred over, like I said, the last 60 minutes. And I see there's about 57,000 logs, which is, a fair amount. And now I could go ahead and start to scroll through these and look at 2,200 pages of logs, but that's really not an efficient use of time. And as I'm looking through these messages of logs, I do see that some successful events occurred. So I see here the checkout service did occur, and I see some of those in here. And then I see some errors. So at this point, I'm looking at a mixture of all my information. And so, like I said, I can go ahead and start to scroll through 2,200 pages of data, but that's just not sensical in any way. And since you're using Sumo Logic, you can start to take advantage of some of the features we have in there. And one of the features is advanced analytics, and particularly the log reduce option. And I'm going to go ahead and click on log reduce. And when I do, what's going to occur is essentially it's going to take all of those messages, so approximately, about 58,000 messages, and look at them and look for pattern recognition, essentially, and distill the messages down into patterns that make sense. So it's going to take all of those messages and combine them down into hopefully just a fair handful of messages. So I'm just going to let this finish. We'll just take another moment. It's just about done now. And so what I see at the very top is there were 7,000 or about 8,000 messages that match this pattern. And so this is actually, although I know my service, so I know kind of what to expect here, these are a good sign because these have a transaction ID. So this is kind of an indication that those checkouts did occur. Here we see starting cart checkout process, and those are all kind of good indicators. But down here we see some errors, and we see about 1,500 of them, 1,500 of these as well. And so I'm in the search mode of trying to find out, once again, what caused these errors. And so what I want to look at is I want to flip these patterns around. So rather than looking at events that occurred 8,000 times, 7,000 times, I want to look for events that were probably more singular or maybe less frequent. My thinking or my hypothesis being something caused those errors, and it was probably a singular event. A bit of a leap, but since I've done this demo a few times, I can make that assumption. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to flip my count around. So rather than looking at the most frequent, I'm going to look at the less frequent. And what I see right away is this first line right here. And what I see is Travel Logic app starting cluster, the checkout service, and I see version 1.14 dev. Well, this was a production system and development code was loaded on it. And as a result, that's what caused these errors. So somebody made a human error, let's say, and just loaded the wrong set of code, and that caused the SSL certificates to fail, and as a result, that caused the checkout service to fail. And kind of ta-da. So what I wanted to show here is taking Sumo Logic and using it to, certainly your advantage, of course, and using it to troubleshoot. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump back into the slide deck to kind of highlight or review what we just did. So let me go ahead and grab that slide. Sorry about that. There we go. So what we did in this demo was monitoring troubleshooting, and we looked at three different phases of that. The first part was we looked at the alerts. So we looked at notifications of critical events. In this case, we saw a Slack message as an indication that an event had occurred, and we were able to go into the dashboard and use that view and kind of a simplistic view in a good way to identify something taking place, where we were just able to go into the dashboard and see red bad, green good, and go ahead and help start to drill down and see what was going on. Another component of what we did was using metrics to identify what's going on. So we were able to ingest our hardware information and bring in that CPU usage, that memory usage. Certainly there are other metrics that can be brought in, but we were able to use those and identify what was going on, and the what was the increased CPU usage. And then I was going to say more importantly, but of equal importance, we were able to use the logs to identify why it was happening. And so we were able to take all of that and put it together and ultimately identify the issue. And so that's what I wanted to demonstrate right there. So let's go ahead. I want to show another couple slides here, and then we'll go back into some demonstrations. The Sumo Logic data flow. Certainly want you guys to understand how the data flow works with Sumo Logic. And so these are split up into 3 different areas. The first one would be data collection. So you're going to be using collectors to bring your sets of data into Sumo Logic. We'll go over collectors in a brief view in just a moment, but the short version of this story is essentially your data needs to be brought into Sumo Logic, which I think makes sense. Once it's brought into Sumo Logic, then you can start to search and analyze that data in step number 2. So now your data resides in Sumo, it's sitting there, and now you need to do something with it. So you're going to use operators to go ahead and start to dig through that data and pull out the things that are important to you. You'll be able to use charts to represent kind of that visual component of what's going on with your data, and that's going to be a great way to analyze what's taking place. And then finally, visualizing and monitoring is that alerts and dashboards component. And so the idea there is that even if you don't know your set of data strongly, or you want somebody else outside your team to be able to take a look and see what's going on, these dashboards are going to be a great way to, at a glance, see what's taking place. And so you could envision putting those up in a NOC or a command center so that at a glance you could say, oh, everything's green, that's good. Oh, something's red, that's bad. And even if, like I said, if you don't know your data that well, just using that kind of color scheme, you can help identify what's taking place. And then the alert component as well goes hand in hand, where you can be notified outside of Sumo Logic. So as I mentioned earlier at the start of the call, ideally we don't want you just sitting in Sumo Logic staring at a dashboard 24/7. So with the alerts, you can still be notified of critical events, and as you define those events to be critical, and then you can go ahead and take action on them and then log into Sumo and start to do your troubleshooting or searching and analyzing to see what's taking place. Another slide here regarding sending data to Sumo Logic. I don't want to get too bogged down into the details of this. We will cover this in more specific in level 3 and actually setting up the different collectors. But what I want to show you here is really the variety of different ways that data can be ingested into Sumo Logic. And so really the summation here is there's a bunch of different ways. And as long as data is out there and is readable by a human, it can be ingested into Sumo Logic, and we can treat it and handle it perfectly. So there's a variety of different environments that can be brought into Sumo Logic. Maybe you're using cloud services, Amazon, and using CloudWatch or CloudTrail or any of those popular ones. An S3 bucket can be go ahead and bring that data into Sumo Logic. Maybe you're going to use an HTTPS connection. Maybe you can bring your information via syslog, and you'll have the ability to install these collectors, or actually just point your data to them, to the collectors, depending on if you're using CloudWatch or the S3 properties or not. But like I said, we cover this a little more in more detail in level 3. But just for today, I think it's just important to note that wherever your data is out there, it can be brought into Sumo Logic. And then metadata. I've alluded to metadata a couple times already, but we haven't really discussed what it is, and it's certainly important that you understand what it is and how it's used. So metadata are going to be tags that are associated with each log message. So essentially you have all these logs out there, and you're going to bring them into Sumo Logic, and then you need a way to sort through them or look through them, and you're going to use some sort of identification method to do so. And so there's going to be some that are essentially pre-built or pre-labeled. So you might want to go ahead and search for your data based on the name of the collector, which would be that piece of software that would be installed that would be grabbing your data and bringing it to Sumo Logic. You might use the source name. So I believe we just used the source name in our demo. So that's a way, another option to go ahead and identify your data and allow somebody to search through it. And then finally, there's going to be a source category, and this is what we're going to recommend be used, and is going to be freely configured, which is really where it's going to help. We'll go ahead and take a look at some source categories in just a few moments in the demo. But the way it's going to be used is to identify that data. And by providing a good naming convention, it's going to make it really easy for your users to locate their data. So rather than looking for data on system 2849, they could go ahead and look specifically for production Apache data, for example. And we'll use that Apache example throughout the rest of today, so that's why I bring it up now. So these are going to be typically configured when the data is ingested, the source category specifically will be set up at that point. We would recommend a good naming convention so that it's something that you can, at a glance, recognize where and what that data consists of. We would cover the naming conventions in level 3. So if you're interested and want to learn more about proper naming conventions, best practices, things like that, we'll discuss that in a future webinar. So let's go ahead and take a look at what data can I analyze. So you now have access to Sumo Logic, and you want to see what data is out there for you. And so now let's go ahead and dig into there. There's actually going to be 2 ways to do so, and I'll go ahead and demonstrate those right now. And so let's go ahead and look at them. So the first one is going to be exploring your collectors. And so let me show you in-app what that looks like. And so let me just find my window here. Oops, sorry about that. Here we go. So what I've done now is I've logged into Sumo Logic. Hopefully you guys have seen this environment before, but if you haven't, this is the first time you would, when you log in, you would be brought to this home page. We'll go over some of the tabs in a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and just start to dive in here and show you where the information regarding the data that you want to analyze can be found. So the first way you can go ahead and do so is to actually look at the collectors that are available to you. And so to do so, I'm going to go to Manage Data, and I'm going to go to Collection. And what I'm going to see are all the different collectors, which are those pieces of software essentially that are grabbing the data. And now I can go ahead and view it. And so, for example, let's say I want to look at Apache data, which, as I mentioned earlier, is what we'll be using today. I can go ahead and just type Apache. And I'm going to see all the different sources of Apache data that are available. And so I can go ahead and start to grab one of these and dig in and analyze them. And I'll show you how to do that through the source queries in a few moments. So that's one way to see what's available to you. The other way is you can just simply create a query on your own. So to do so, I'm going to go ahead and click on New, and I'm going to do a new log search. And I'm going to have my query window up here, and I'm going to go ahead and just enter a very simple query. First, I'm going to go ahead and enter a star, which is going to represent that I want to look at all my data. And then I'm going to add a new line, and I'm going to use a pipe to recognize that that's a new line. And I'm going to do a count by source category. Source category. And so now what I'm looking at is pretty similar to the information I was looking at in the collection window, but just a different view of it. And so here I see all the different source categories that exist, and I see a count for the amount of messages that have occurred in those logs for the last 15 minutes. So we're looking at a 15-minute chunk of time. And so I see here, there were certainly a lot of Symantec firewall logs and a lot of Cisco logs, not too many PagerDuty, and you can certainly just get a feel for where or what's making up a large percentage of your data. And if I look down here, I see Labs Apache Access representing 54,000 log messages. And like I mentioned earlier, this is the source category that we're going to go ahead and use for today. So that's an easy way that you can go ahead and see what data is available for you. Let's go ahead and jump back into the PowerPoint. Oops, sorry, I keep doing that. Here it is. And so now how can I analyze my data? So now you've gone ahead, you've found the source category, you want to go ahead and start to go ahead and analyze that data. So how do you do so? So variety of different ways to do so in the system, and I'm going to show you a couple right now. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back into, actually I'll show you a couple slides and then we'll do in-app. So one way is you can simply see what other people have done within the environment. So you can look for shared content. So basically I can go ahead and see, has anybody else looked at this set of data? Have they created queries or dashboards that might be valuable to me? And to do so, I'm going to go ahead and jump back into the app here. And so I'm going to go ahead and, oops, sorry about that. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at shared content. So up here on the top of the screen, we actually have a couple different ways to look at shared content. On the left-hand side of the screen, I'm going to have 4 different options. And let me go through these now because might as well, because it's a good point. The first is I can see some recent things that have been shared with me, recent things I've done. Very similar if you've used, well, most products do a recent now, but basically it's going to be the things that you've done, recently, kind of a quick way to get to access to those. So that's a good way to see things that you've done recently. Another is to look at your favorites. So you've created a query maybe previously and you saved it and you want to mark it as a favorite, and you can go ahead and do it so in Sumo Logic. So similar to the way you would in a browser, it's like a bookmark essentially. You have a personal folder. So here you can go ahead and view all those different queries that you've saved out. Both queries, dashboards, really anything within Sumo Logic that you've saved out. And so here I've gone ahead and I've created some Apache queries before and some Microsoft Office 365. And these are things that I've done previously. But I want to, in this case, I want to see what other people have done because I want to take advantage of that. So I can go ahead and click on this icon here, which is going to represent the library. And now I'm able to see all the other things that other users have done. Now, in this case, there's a lot of Apache folders because I'm on a training site, and we've had other students use this site. But that's perfectly fine. So let's say I want to go ahead and look at one of these, and I want to see what information is in here. If I go ahead and click on Apache, I'm going to go ahead and see that there's all these different queries. The orange represents queries, and I'm going to see the green that represents dashboards, and there's all these different dashboards. And now I can go ahead and look at these. So let's say I see this Apache overview. Oh, that sounds kind of interesting. What is it though? Let me go ahead and click on it. And now what I get is an overview of, in this case, visitor locations. So in this case, I have a map that's been created for me, and I'm able to view the visitor locations regionally. And so that's kind of cool. One of the cool things about these maps, we'll look at the maps in a little bit later, but I can zoom in these. So let's say right now I'm able to see, there's been a lot of traffic or visitor locations in the Northeast. Let me go ahead and look more specifically where those are. And I can actually drill into the map here, and I can see more specifically, Pittsburgh area has this many and Washington has this many. And so that's kind of cool. And so, maybe this is something that I want to take advantage of. Somebody did this hard work to go ahead and create this map, and maybe I want to go ahead and modify it. And what I can do is I can click on this icon here that says show and search. And what it's going to do is it's going to bring that query into the search window, and it's going to allow me to customize it. Now, this query language up here is going to be maybe a little bit foreign to you. So this is certainly level 1. So these are the query language itself we would cover in level 2. But this is a good point where you can go ahead and see, hey, this is what somebody else did. This is how they set it up. And you can start to use this on your own. So maybe you want to start to change some of this information. So rather than looking only at let's see, country name of the United States, you want to look at, I don't know, let's see if there's any data for, actually, I don't think there is any. But so you could go ahead and start to modify in here different information. So let's go ahead and show another way to take advantage of some methods to look at your data rather than just a straight query. And let me go ahead and jump back to the slide to show what I want to. Here we go in the slide. So the other option is to use our app catalog. And so what is the app catalog? And as it says up here, if you want to read it, the apps are designed to accelerate your time in Sumo Logic. And what they are is essentially pre-configured searches and dashboards for the most common use cases. So the way the apps are going to work is, and let me go ahead and jump into the app catalog right there. Here we go. And so the way this is going to work is one of the cool things, or as cool as logs can be, is that they're consistent in the way they're designed. So a Apache access log is always going to be in the same format, regardless if you're using it or an organization and another organization is using it. They're always going to be in the same format. We'll look at the formats in a little bit, but for example, it always has the IP address, it always has a timestamp following, et cetera, et cetera. And since that we know that that's going to take place, we know that the formatting is always going to be the same, we can take advantage of that, and as a result, you can take advantage of that. So let's say I want to go ahead and start to look at these predefined example searches and dashboards. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Apache, and I see all the different types of, in this case, the orange, once again, is the queries, and the green are the dashboards, and I see all these different types of pieces of information that are available to me. And so I can go ahead and look at some examples. So let's say I want to go ahead and look at the Apache overview. I can actually preview the dashboard up here, and I see this overview, and once again, it's another map. But I see, hey, this is kind of interesting. Oh, this visitor access types, yeah, it would be helpful to see visitor platforms. And so now I want to go ahead and take advantage of these queries. In order to set it up, it's going to be really simple. And it could be really complicated because I could go through the query, and as you saw with that query language, I could go ahead and write that query, but that's pretty advanced. So what I can do to streamline the process is I can click Add to Library. And all I'm going to need to do is identify where my data is. So I'm going to tell it, hey, look in Labs Apache Access, because that's where my lab data is. And I'm going to want it to reference that environment. The other thing I do is just need to give it a name. As you can see, there were a lot of Apaches, so I'm going to go ahead and just give it a name that's hopefully unique. So I don't think there's a AAA Apache yet. And I'm going to click Add to Library. It's going to take a moment to run. And once it's done, it's going to allow me to then go ahead and look at those dashboards and in the with the set of data that I just referenced. So here we see I'm now looking at AAA Apache. I also have it available to me if I look in my library, so in my personal library. So there it is, just a couple different ways to look at it. And now I can go ahead and look at one of these. So maybe let's say I want to look at this time, I want to look at visitor access types. When I click on it, it's going to go ahead and take the query and essentially just overlay my sets of data in there. So now it's looking specifically at Lab Apache Access, and it's showing my visitor platforms. And so this is a way that I can go ahead and start taking advantage of Sumo Logic without doing any of the heavy lifting that it comes with the query. And so we would certainly encourage you to take advantage of those app catalog items. And just, as you saw, it was pretty easy to set up. So would recommend doing so. Let's go ahead and jump back into the slide deck. Sorry, I keep doing that. There we go. And let's go ahead and this portion, so if you were doing the tutorial, at this point you would go ahead and do some of these steps as far as actually installing a Sumo Logic app on your own, logging in certainly, searching for existing content. And so as I mentioned at the beginning of the call, I would certainly encourage you to go ahead and do these hands-on exercises on your own. I think it will certainly be beneficial. But I'm going to skip this portion just kind of for the essence of time. And you just saw me go through all those steps, so we kind of did that demo together. So now let's go ahead and get into the data analytics side of things regarding queries. So taking kind of a step back in our scenario, you now have all this data loaded into Sumo Logic. You saw what data is relevant to you, or in this case, we're going to be looking at, once again, that Apache information. And now you need to go ahead and start to query on it. And so how does the query work? How does it work more particularly in Sumo Logic? So within the Sumo Logic environment, you're going to be using keywords and operators that are going to be separated by pipes and built on top of one another. So you can go ahead and envision this model here where you have a very big funnel and all your data is at the top of the funnel. And ultimately you want to have the good stuff, or the goodness, essentially come out as your results. And so the way it's going to work is you're going to start to load things into this funnel, and using these different sections of syntax, we're going to start to go ahead and essentially filter out the things that are needed. So you're going to start with, let's go ahead and look at a query right here. So this is a sample query. And so we're going to start with the metadata and keywords. And so, for example, and I'll start to do this in a real example in actually probably in a moment here. But basically what you're doing is you're starting to identify, this is the set of data I want to look at. And I want to look at a specific keyword. Once you have that set of data, you're going to want to go ahead and start to parse data out. And with parsing, what you're going to do is extract meaningful fields to provide structure to your data. So essentially, you're going to start to label some of those fields of data. Next, you're going to go ahead and filter some of the data out. And here's an example of parsing, and we'll look at these in just a minute. You're going to go ahead and start to filter your results. So you now have information and fields that you've created. Now you want to go ahead and start to filter on those fields. With the aggregation, you're going to go ahead and start to place them into groups. Let's see, we have an example. Some of the mathematical operators, you can start to do counts. So for example, we just did that count earlier of source categories. We can do averages and things like that. And we'll play with a couple of the operators in a moment. And then ultimately, you can go ahead and start to format your results. So now you've you've created, pulled essentially a set of data, and now you want to manipulate it to something that's a little more friendly. So let's go ahead and jump back into the application and go through a more specific example and show you what those things I just described really look like. So let's go ahead and jump back in here. And I'm going to go to the Home tab, and I'm going to go to New Log Search. You can also go to New Log Search over here, but I'm going to either way, kind of same difference. And so now I have a window that's going to allow me to start to do a query. And so how do I do my query? And let's start with a very simple one. So up here we have a search window, and what I can do is I can just go ahead and start to type my query. So let's say I want to go ahead and start to search for Mozilla. I can just very simply type Mozilla and hit start. And here we go, and now I have my results. And so what I have on here, a couple of things that are certainly worth noting on here, is first I have my search window here. This is going to be search case insensitive. So that's why even though I entered a lowercase m, we see capital M's down here. And we actually see, since we're looking for a keyword, in our result sets, we actually see the keyword highlighted. So that's going to be helpful. We also have a time window or time selector up here. And so what's going to happen by default is I'm going to be able to search for the last 15 minutes of data. And so these will be the messages from the last 15 minutes, but maybe you'll want to change that. And certainly many times you will want to change the time. And so to do so, you're going to go ahead and click on the time here, and you're going to have some predefined time categories. So maybe I want to look at the last 60 minutes, or I want to look at data from the last 3 hours, et cetera, et cetera. I can go ahead and choose those time options. Another time option I have is I can go to custom, and I can use this kind of calendaring feature to say, all right, I specifically want to look for logs from July 2nd to July 10th, and from 3 a.m. on the 2nd to 5 a.m. And you can get very specific with your time in the custom. So that's a second way to set up or configure time. And of course, there's going to be a third way because we want to give you many options. And you can kind of see the syntax for it up here. So when I chose last 3 hours, when I click on it, I have this time syntax of -3h. And so what I can do is I can use that to customize my time. And so I can more specifically say, let's say I want to look at the last 5 hours of time. I can just go ahead and do -5h. Maybe I want to do the last 24 minutes of time. I can just simply do -24m. Maybe I want to go ahead and do the last 24 minutes to the last 12 minutes. I can go ahead and specify, and you can actually see it right here. In this case, it would look only from 9:22 to 9:35. So I can really have a couple different options of how I'm going to choose my time. The other thing to be aware of in here with time, and I'm going to just set it back to the last 15 minutes, is you have this option of using receipt time. And I just moused over it, and I think you should be able to see what it says there. But basically, it's going to allow you to search for the messages when they were received in the system, not from the dates parsed by them. And so the way that works, I don't want to get too bogged down in that, but I do want you guys to understand how that works, is what we're looking at in these log messages here is when the records were essentially created. Or excuse me, when the dates were parsed from them. So we see here that this data was from just a few minutes ago, and it pulls up in here. What the scenario that could occur, however, is let's say you go ahead and this morning you've loaded data from the last 6 months in. You could go ahead and use your search for the last 6 months, or you could go ahead and use your receipt time and say, I want to look for that data, and since it just got loaded, you could look at it when it got loaded rather than using the dates that were in the message itself. So just a couple different options there. And typically you would use the default here and not use receipt time, but just wanted to make sure you were aware of that feature. Let's see, other things on here. This is a busy screen, but in a good way because you're going to be spending a lot of time in it. Let me go ahead and just, oops, there we go. So up here we have some options as far as saving. So we have the favorite icon, which I mentioned earlier, so which you guys are, I'm sure, all familiar with how to use. You have the save as. So let's say you have created this query and I want to go ahead and save it for future use. I can click save as, and I can go ahead and give it a name, and it will show up and be saved in my personal section. So that's certainly an option as well. And then there's a couple other options in here. You have the ability to go ahead and share this query out. So you've created this query. You want to go ahead and give it to somebody else. Certainly you can go ahead and direct them to the library if you've shared it out in that method. But the other option is you can go ahead and just give them a code that they can use or a URL. So they can go ahead and take this URL, paste it into the browser, and they're going to go ahead and get the query that you created. An even cooler option is using this code here. So I can just go ahead and copy this code, click done. And now if I open a new browser, or a new search window rather, I can paste that code in, and it's going to bring in the query exactly as I had it. And that's a really cool way to go ahead and share the queries via, let's say if you're collaborating with someone via Slack, for example. Rather than taking your query and cutting it and pasting it, or even giving a URL, you can just say, hey, look at this code number, 123 or whatever the code is, and then they would easily be brought into that query, and they would essentially be looking at the same thing that you had created, which is really useful. Let's see. A couple of other options here. You can go ahead and pin this search, which is going to allow the search to continue to run, even if you step away from or log out of your system. And then live tail, and we'll look at live tail in a moment, so I'll kind of leave that on the back burner. Other pieces of information on this screen, there's a lot going on, so I want to make sure that we're aware of it. I'm just going to redo my search here just to clean this up for a second. In the middle here, we have a histogram, which is showing distribution of messages across the time frame that we've selected. So we selected a 15-minute window, and as a result, we're seeing essentially time slices by 1 minute. So we see the count of messages. So for this query of Mozilla for the last 15 minutes, there was a total of about 83,000 results. But we see here from 9:43 that window, so 9:43 to 9:44, there were 5,000 messages. That next window, almost 6,000, etc. So that's a good way to see at a glance, kind of graphing information about the distribution of those messages. And then down here we have our results, which is certainly going to be important. We're going to have our time stamp. So this is going to go ahead and indicate when that message is from. And then we're going to have the message itself. And as I described a moment ago, the keywords will be highlighted in there. So now we've gone ahead and we've done a very basic query, and we actually have some more that we can go ahead and do. So let's go ahead and expand this query out and actually make it a little more useful. So what I want to look at now is, rather than just looking at Mozilla across the entire index and the entire body of data, I more specifically want to look at our Apache data. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm actually just going to do a new line just to kind of so you can see the search ahead. So I'm going to go ahead and define my source category. And before I even type, it's going to go ahead and start to do a search ahead. So here I have a source category, so I can just click on that. And then I can go ahead and specify my, more specifically, the source category I want to use. And the search ahead will work there. So I'm going to use labs Apache Access. And I'm going to go ahead as well and still search for Mozilla. And I'm going to type Mozilla. And I'm going to hit start. And a couple things are happening here. So now we're specifically looking for Lab Apache Access data that has the string of Mozilla in it. The other thing to keep in mind up here is there's going to be an implied end statement. So this and this are the same thing. And so just to keep in mind, if you want to leave out the end, you can. It's of course up to you and how you decide to kind of code your query, but just want you to recognize there is an implied end. And with the implied end, so it's looking for Lab Apache Access and those logs that have the keyword or the string of Mozilla. And so that's a very basic query. But I want to go ahead and start to make this more advanced. And so let's go ahead and do so. So what I want to do now in this scenario is we're going to take the set of data, and I want to look for what are called status codes. Some of you are probably familiar with status codes. Some of you may not. A status code is basically when you go to a website, on the back end, essentially, it's going to be a indication of the results of that experience, I guess you could say. So if you go to a site successfully, you get a status code 200. I'm sure many of you have seen status code 404s, where you go to a page and the file or the page cannot be found. And so we're going to play with those status codes right now. And so what I want to do with this this right here is I want to go ahead and start to parse my information out. And by parsing it out, basically I have my log message here, and I want to identify within the system where what to look for in a status code, or where to find any of this information. So for example, right here we have an IP address, we have some date information, and over here we have our status code. In this case, this one is 304. And so like I said, I want to go ahead and start to look for all these status codes, the 304s, or excuse me, any status codes. And so what I can do is I can start to create a parsing expression that's going to allow me to do that. And so I actually have two different ways, actually many more, about three different ways I can go ahead and parse these fields out. So let me show you one way to go ahead and do it. And actually for this example, I'm going to actually parse out the IP address. So that will just be, I think, a better illustration. So I'm going to go ahead and just steal some code that I was playing with earlier and bring it in here, and I'll explain what exactly I'm doing with this code. So let me just go ahead, and there we go. Cool. So what I want to do now is I want to go ahead and I want to look at my IP addresses. So we'll take a break for these status codes for just a second, but I want to go ahead and look for IP addresses. And so I see in these messages, I see an IP address, and I see an IP address there. And I'm only looking at this IP address, the host IP address. We're going to ignore. That's referring more to the collector, the metadata for the host. That I'm not really interested in right now. In this case, I just want to see the IP address that's associated with each message. And so how do I go ahead and use those? And more specifically, how do I go ahead and start to be able to take advantage of those fields and start to report on them? So the first way that you can go ahead and do so is you can use regex. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with regex. I'm sure some of you are and are dreading hearing the word regex. Regex, what it's going to allow you to do, and regex is a global standard. It's not a Sumo Logic specific thing. What it allows you to do is essentially create some pattern matching. And so let me show you an example of a regex statement. And here we have one right here. So what we're doing with this regex is we're going ahead and identifying the field. And basically what we're telling it to do is look for a digit that has between 1 and 3 digits in it, look for a dot, look for 1 to 3 digits, look for a dot, et cetera, et cetera. And so that would match an IP address. So an IP address is going to be made up of essentially number, dot, number, dot, number, dot, number. And so we're telling it to go ahead and look for that pattern. And I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and I'll show you, what's going to occur. And so when I run this, I now have my IP addresses displayed here, and I can start to use these IP addresses. And so I could go ahead and, for example, let's say I wanted to do a count of my IP addresses. I can go ahead and do so. And so now what I did is at first I'd use the second line here to go ahead and essentially identify or tell the system what an IP address looks like or what to look for in the pattern recognition, and call that field IP address, which that's what this part is doing, is saying, when you find this pattern, call that an IP address. And then once I have my IP addresses as displayed down here, then I can go ahead and start to do some further querying on them. So that's one way to go ahead and start to do your parsing, particularly parsing via regex. But as I mentioned, regex is very finicky, it's very specific, and while it's a good standard, it's not the easiest way to do your query. And we want to make this easy for you guys, so I want to show you a couple alternatives on how to go ahead and parse your data out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just clean up my screen here. I'm going to go ahead and comment these 2 lines out by doing 2 slashes on each line. What a comment does is essentially turns off that line. So that line, when I run my query again, it will skip those lines in the query. And as you can see here, it's basically just running this first line. And so what I want to do now is I want to show you a secondary way to do parsing. And what this is using is what we call parse anchor. And the way it works is you're going to just use the mouse and essentially start to click on some sections. So let me show you specifically how it works. So I'm going to I need to pull that IP address. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this whole message and I'm going to highlight it. And I'm going to click parse the selected text. And now I have my whole message here. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and start to identify those pieces of the message and create fields from them, and use the pattern recognition to do so as well. So I'm going to take this first portion of the message, and I'm going to highlight it. Oop, there we go. Click to extract this value, and I'm going to go ahead and call this IP address. I could call it IP, I could call it network identification, I can call it whatever I want, but I want to call it something that make sense to me and others if they look at my code. So I've now labeled this an IP address. And I'm going to keep going. So I'm going to go ahead and this section here. Now I could go ahead and specifically say that this is the year, this is the month, this is the day, this is the hour, et cetera, et cetera. But for my demo, and usually, I don't really care about that. So I'm just going to take this whole thing, and I'm just going to call it time, and just kind of lump it together. And I'm going to keep going through here, and just give me a second. So I'm going to take this, and I'm going to call this the refer. And I'm going to take this guy, and I'm going to call this the status code. And as I mentioned, we'll be using the status code going forward, so I'm going to call it status code. I can call it with an underscore. I can't use a space, so this would not be acceptable, but I could use that or that. And then let me just finish this up. I'm going to call this the size. So this is the size of the message. We're not really going to use it today, but just so you're aware. And then I'm going to take this part, almost here, done. Just a couple more sections here. I'm going to call that the URL. And then finally, I'm going to take this whole portion here, and I'm going to call it user agent. What it is it's an identification of the browser or the environment that the visitor is using when they go to a website. So it's going to show information about operating system, browser type, those type of things. And I'm just going to lump it together as call it user agent. And I'm going to click submit. And what's going to happen now is it's going to take this pattern recognition and matching and go ahead and look through our logs messages for it and match those patterns together. And so basically, it's going to look for the first part of the message. And it's going to find that part, and it's going to call that an IP address. It's going to look for a space. It's going to look for a dash. It's going to look for a space, look for a dash, look for an open bracket. And whatever's in that open bracket, it's going to call time. Look for a closed bracket, etc. So let's go ahead and start and run this, and we'll see what it really is doing. So here we now have these sections broken out. So now I have my IP address, I have my refer, I have my size, my status, all these different fields that we just labeled. And so that's a good way that I can now start to query on those. And so what I can do, for example, is now let's say, let's go to status codes because now I can more easily access them. Now I can go ahead and do a count by status code. And since the system knows, hey, this is a status code, essentially look for it right here, it's going to go ahead and look for those status codes. And now I'm going to be doing a count. So now in this case, I'm going ahead and doing some aggregation, doing some mathematics to go ahead and say, this is the amount of status codes that have occurred over the last 15 minutes. So that's the second way to parse your information out. Looks like we just got a question. When parsing with the mouse and highlighting, is every value created assumed to be a string, or can you assign data types? A string. So these are strings. It's just simply looking at the message and doing the very straightforward pattern recognition. So I want to show another way that we can go ahead and essentially pull out these fields. So let me go ahead and clean this up again and kind of reset myself. So I'm going to go ahead and remove the parsing. Let me remove the count because I don't really need this. So I'm just going to turn off those lines. I might use them later, so that's why I'm going to keep them. And let me start this, and now we're just back to where we were, back to kind of square one. So let's say I now want to go ahead and start to use those status codes. You'll notice, or now you'll notice that I pointed out, on the left side of the screen, we have a variety of different fields that we were just actually using. So we have IP address, we have status code, and I can go ahead and use these. And so if I want to go ahead and do a count by status code, I can go ahead and only do count by status code. And when I run it, the system is going to know where status code is and how to essentially utilize it. Now, how does the system know what the status code is? How did it create these fields? What the mechanism to do to create these fields is what we call field extraction rules, or FERs. And the way the field extraction rules work is essentially the parsing is done upon ingestion. So in this case, we did the query, and in our query we did the parsing, but you can actually have it set up so that when the data gets ingested into Sumo Logic, these fields are automatically applied. And the reason it works so well is since an Apache access message, for example, Apache access, but these would work with any types of content or log messages. Since an Apache log message is the same, we can recognize, hey, it's always going to be in this pattern. Always look for that first space or that first piece of content, that's going to be an IP address. Then look for a space, look for another space. So it's essentially doing the parsing upon ingestion, which is going to be a really great way to go ahead and simplify this process so that you don't have to go ahead and do this parsing that we did up here, either via regex or via this parsing mechanism. So these field extraction rules would be set up previously. I'll go ahead and show you where they are in the environment. I don't want you to get too bogged down with it, but I do just want you to give the visual. So if I go ahead into my settings, and these are things we would cover more in session 2 and session 3, but just while we're here, I think it's worth showing. So basically the way these rules work, and there's a lot of them because we do a lot of testing with this account, but basically what it's doing is it's looking at, and actually let's open one up. So what it's doing is it's saying, hey, I want to create an Apache access rule. I want to go ahead and say all this data, so anything that comes in with, in this case, anything Apache access is going to have this parse expression applied to it. And this is the pattern recognition that we were just discussing. So here we see source IP is going to look for essentially number, and that will be the way that it recognizes, hey, call that a source IP. Then look for something else, call that a method. Look for something else, call that a URL, and so on and so forth. And so those are going to be really helpful that we would encourage you to set up upon ingestion to make both your life and your users' lives much easier. But let's go back into the query and continue further. So, let's see, where are we going to, let's go back, let's run this. And so what we're looking at right now is we're essentially looking at our Apache access information, and we're still looking at the string of Mozilla, and we're looking at account by status code. And when we run it, since we're doing account, which is essentially mathematics at this point, we get a new tab called aggregates, and that's shown here. So we have our messages tab that is going to show the raw messages as well as the fields that we're parsing. And then we're going to have our aggregates tab that will show that mathematics. In this case, we were doing count by status code. So we see our status codes and we see a count. And once again, the count is representing all the different messages that occurred that match this pattern over the last 15 minutes. But let's go deeper now. So we now have our status codes. Now let's start to play around with them and start to garner some information from them. So as I just mentioned, I'm looking at these status codes by essentially a 15-minute grouping. But let's say I want to look at trends over time. So I want to look at the status codes in 1-minute increments, similar to the way that they're shown up here. But I want to actually look at the specific status codes. So what I can do is I can go ahead and just add a new line up here. And I'm going to add a line. It's called time slice. And as I type it, the search ahead is going to work for me. And it's also going to tell me what it does. So it says time slice, segment data by time periods or bucketed over time range. Yep, that's what I want. So I'm going to time slice, and I'm going to do it by 1-minute chunks. And I'm going to hit enter. And now what I'm going to get, oh, I need to add one more line here. So now I need to tell it, hey, do a count by those time slices or by those 1-minute segments and show the status code. So now when I run it, I'm going to have these time slices. So here we have these. So here at 9:59, so essentially the minute of 9:59 to 9:59:59, we see that there were 612,304 status codes. And at 10:03, there were 36,403 codes, and so on and so forth. And so, this is good. The results are there, but they're not in a chronological order, which visually just makes it a little tricky to look at. So let me go ahead and put them in order. And so what I want to do is I want to order these time slices in ascending order. So in my query, I'm going to do order by time slice. Sorry about that. Time slice ascend, and just going to run that now. And what that's going to do is it's going to do what it sounds like and what it should. It's going to put those time slices in order. So now I see all the 952s. So I see 952s, 953s, 954s. And so this is, it's better. It's starting to get some information, a little better visually, but it's not there, or it's not the way I want it to be. And so what I'd like to see is a list of the time slices down the columns and status codes as my rows. So similar the way you would do transposition or transposing in Excel. And so that's what I want to do, and let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new line, and I'm going to do transpose. And as I type it, transpose aggregated results. That's what I want to do. And I'm just going to go ahead and label my rows and columns. So I'm going to say my row, put the time slice there, and my column, put the status code there. And so now what I get is something more visually pleasing. We're still going to go further with it, but this is better. So now I have my time. So I have my 9:53, and then I see the time slices at the top. So I can pretty easily see, at 9:55 there were 3,200, which are those successful connections, and there were only, or not only, but there were 138 404s, and this is. I'm able to get some more information from this, but it's not really easy to digest the problem at this point. So what I have, I can take advantage of is I can take look at some of the other charting options that are built into Sumo Logic. So up here, we've been looking at, when we wrote our aggregates, we've been looking at this view, which is kind of a table view. But let's say I want to look at, I want to convert this into a graph. Maybe I want to do a bar chart. Here's my information in a bar chart. Maybe I want to do a column chart. Okay, that's kind of cool. Not really what I want though. This line chart I like though. This is showing me the status codes and graphing them over time. So okay, I'm going to stick with this one. But this is a little tricky, this view, because I see my 200s, I see my 304s, and then down here, I see those other status codes, but they're kind of lumped together, they're kind of hidden. And so what I want to do is I want to clean this chart up a little bit, and I want to really look at this set of information, not these first two. And so I have two different ways I can do this. The first is I can actually do it within the graph. So if I say, all right, I don't want to see 200s, just go over to 200 over here with the legend, click 200, and it's been turned off. Same thing with 304. Where's 304? There it is, turned off. And now I get my scale has been adjusted. And now, once again, kind of visually, it's more pleasing and makes sense as to what's going on. So that's one way I could go ahead and essentially alter that set of data. The other, though, is let's say I want to do it within my query. I want to go ahead and leave out the 200s and the 304s. I can go ahead and actually just add a line in my query. So what I'm going to do is add a new line right here. And I'm going to do a where statement. So I'm going to do where status code is equal to 200, or status code is equal to 304. And since I want to essentially remove those, I'm going to go ahead and put an exclamation point. And so what I'm doing here is I'm saying pull the lab Apache access data with the string or the string in this case of Mozilla, and look for status code 200 and 304, or rather not. So basically exclude these two. Excuse me. So now if I run this query, I don't have my 200 or 304 in here, and if I look at my raw messages, I'm not going to go ahead and see a 200 or a 304 in here. But what I do want to see, let me go ahead and reset this one more time, because I do want to show one more feature. Actually, I want to show a bunch more. So let me go ahead and let's remove this one for right now. I did want to show in the field browser over here one thing that's really cool, and we'll use the status codes as an example. So I have my query right here, and in this case, we're back to just looking essentially just for labs Apache access and Mozilla sets of data. We're formatting it down here, but really we're just looking for those here. So let's say, and this will work with my field extraction rules. Let's say I want to go ahead and look at the status codes and get a feel for how many status codes are occurring and breakdown. I can go ahead and click on this status code. Oh, actually, I need to get rid of these because these are, sorry about that, these are affecting my results. Let me go ahead and start from scratch there. Actually, I can just go ahead and delete all this since we're not using it. So, so I'm back to my original query right now. And so we were looking at status codes. What I can do is I can go ahead and click on the status code here, and it's going to show me for this 15-minute time window, it's going to show me all the values up to, I believe only 10 will show up in here. So if there were more, it would be limited, but it's going to show me the values. It's going to show me the number or the count of those status codes. So this is how many status codes exist during this 15-minute time window. And the other thing it's going to show me is the percentage. So here I can see just easily, 73% of the status codes were 200 and 15% of them were 304. The other thing I can do here, because there's a bunch of things I can do here, is I can actually take one of these and put them into my query. So let's say I wanted to go ahead and continue my query, but I only want to look at 200s. I could go ahead and do where status code equals 200. I'm not going to do it just to save myself typing for a second. Or I can go ahead and click on status code, click on 200, and it's automatically going to bring that into my query. And so now I'm looking at the status codes for 200, And one, I didn't have to type in my query that I want to look for status code 200. And the other thing, since I'm taking advantage of the field extraction rules, is I didn't even have to do parsing to identify what a status code is. And so I'm able to take advantage of the smart kind of logic that's going on with the system and take advantage of that. So that's kind of cool. Let's go ahead and let's see. Um, I want to show you in here the ability to export results. So you create a query. In this case, we're looking at status code 200, and that's cool data. And let's say you want to go ahead and export it. If you just click on this gear icon, it's going to allow you to export either only the display fields or all the fields, but it's going to push it out into a CSV file. And then you can take that CSV file and do whatever you need to do with it, import it to another system, or just analyze that data. So that's going to be an easy way for you to take your data that's available to you and just put it into a different format that might be helpful. Let's go ahead and look at some different operators now. So we've looked at a couple, but I want to show two in particular. So let me go ahead and jump into our training folder. Let's see. Sorry about that, training. And I want to go ahead and look at outliers first. So let's see, I have an example here. There it is. And so what I'm looking at right now, it's going to take a second to load. Oh, let me go ahead and specify that. So what before I run this, what I'm going to show you, and just so you can kind of see what's going to be popping up on the screen, is I'm going to take our set of lab Apache access data. We're going to look at the status code 200. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the outlier command. And we actually saw this earlier with the gateway latency. But essentially what we're going to do is we're going to create thresholds, and then we're going to be able to be notified when those 200s, in this case, exceed that threshold. So let's go ahead and just run this and see what kind of data we get back. So when I run it, I get still in my tabular view, and so I get my data back. And so here, and I'll show you this in a better view in a second, but just to show you kind of the raw content, not to get too bogged down on it, but basically it's doing some mathematics. And so it's looking at 917, there were almost 4,200 status codes. And so it's starting to set an upper and a lower threshold limit. And so it's saying basically using all this information, it was expecting between about 4,000 and 2,000, and that fits in there. So that's good. And so let's go ahead and look at this in a different way. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to flip this into the line chart, and now this will be much more visually pleasing. So what I see here is I have my dark blue line, which is representing the essentially the amount of messages that match the query. So for example, at 9:30, we see that there were 3,100 status codes of 200. And there was, based on this outlier information up here, there was a threshold that was established between about 2,400 and 3,500. And so since that number is within that threshold, it's within the threshold being represented by the light blue line. But if we look over here, we see that based on the mathematics, the threshold was expected to be between 2,500 and 3,600, but there were only just a little bit, but there were only 2,494 count of those status codes. And that falls outside of our norm or outside of our threshold that we're expecting. And so we were able to see those type of outlier events. Let me show you it in a better way, because the 200, I think, is useful. This would show successful connections, but let's say you want to see all the unsuccessful connections. So what I'm doing is I'm just flipping this around, looking for status code 404s, and now I see two different examples here. So keep in mind those 404s are bad, and so what I see here is while they're bad, they were within that acceptable range throughout most of this 60-minute window, but we see two examples of outliers here. The first one we see right here, the system was expecting between about 118 and 169 404 errors, and there were only 113. So that's outside the expected norm. Over here, we were expecting between 100 and 176, and there were actually 177, which is outside that norm as well. Now, in my mind, looking at this set of data, the fact that there were less 404s, less failed connections than expected is kind of a good thing. That's it's a good problem to have. And so I don't really want to see when it's underneath. I only want to see when it's exceeding what is expected. So using the outlier, I can just change this option here, which is direction. So rather than looking above and below the threshold, I just want to look when it's above the threshold. And so now when I run this, I should lose that left pink triangle, and I only have the one where it exceeds. And so that's how I can go ahead and start to use the outlier to help establish an acceptable range. Um, the documentation will give you more detail as far as what these do. I don't really want to get too bogged down. What it's doing is saying, how many standard deviations do you want to do, and how many trailing points. Those are kind of the nitty gritty details, which would of course be relevant if you were setting this up. But for now, I just want to illustrate that view. The other example I want to show right now is plotting requests on a map. So let me go ahead and pull this guy up. And so what I'm doing here, let me alter that too. Okay. So what I'm doing here is I'm using parsing to go ahead and pull out these IP addresses. So in each of my Apache messages, I have that IP address that I've referenced, a few times, and I'm essentially pulling it out and calling it client IP. Then what I'm doing is assuming, or as long as the IP address is public, you can use a geo lookup up here to go ahead or we would actually do it for you, to determine the latitude and longitude of that IP address. And you can actually look up some other additional information, so you can see the city of that IP address, the state, the country, and the country code as well. And so what I want to do is, let's say I want to go ahead and see a count of where my people are, or where my traffic is coming from. So if I look at the aggregate, I see essentially that mathematics, or a summation of that information. And I do see it here. I see that there were 7,000 people or connections that came from latitude 37, longitude minus 122. Now, if I'm really good at geography, I would know that this is wherever in the world, but I'm not. So I wanted to have this information displayed in something that's a little more friendly to me. So I'm going to take advantage of the mapping options we have here, or the graphing options, and one of them is a map option. And I just simply click on the map, and now I get a map overlaid with those connections. And so now I can see that, whatever, that there are, almost 20,000 connections in the northeast of the US, and about 2,000 in or Europe over here, and, so on and so forth. And so this is a cool way that I can go ahead and take that set of data, manipulate it to something that makes sense, and view that information on a map and actually plot it. And I'll show you in a few moments how we can go ahead and take that data and actually share it out with other people as well. Let's go ahead and look at another scenario. We actually looked at this a little bit earlier, but I want to show it a little more thoroughly. So I'm going to do a new tab just to kind of reset myself. And we're going to look at a new set of data. We're going to look at source category, security, snort data. And what snort data is, besides something that's fun to say, is essentially security data. And so what we see here, we're going to be using the advanced analytics to actually look through this, but just visually, if we take a quick look, we see different types of classifications of different events that have occurred. So here we see there was an attempted information leak, and a web application attack, and denial of service. I saw that around there, and a bunch of events. And I'm going to expand my time range out just to get some more data, because this will demo a little bit better with larger set of data. And so we see that there were about 6,000 different events or reports or classifications that have occurred over the past hour. And so, as I showed earlier, when I was doing the demo, when you get to this point, you can certainly scroll through all 243 pages and start to look through this data and start to, try and get a sense of it. But that's not a very good use of anyone's time. So what you can do is you can go ahead and click on log reduce. And as mentioned earlier, that's going to take all the data and distill it down into those common patterns. And so let's let it run, and it's just about finished. And so now what we see is, rather than looking at about 200 pages, we see these breakdowns in the commonalities of things that occurred. So we see that there were about 3,000 attempted information leaks over the last 60 minutes. And 624 sensitive data, and we see, network Trojan was detected. Now, whether that's good or bad, in my mind, it's kind of good that the system caught it, so that's a good thing. But regardless, we see a bunch of different events that have occurred. But let's say we want to go ahead and see how this compares to another time period. If we click on log compare, what's going to occur is the data is going to go ahead and, or the system rather, excuse me, is going to look at the data that occurred the last 60 minutes from now. So from 9:23 to 10:23 Pacific time right now, and it's also going to go back 24 hours and see what occurred from 9:23 to 9:23 to 10:23 yesterday. And here we're going to go ahead and get some percentages. So we see here that there were a decrease of 2% of tentative information leak. Well, sounds like it's a good thing. At least it's a decrease. Here we see there was 21% increase of successful administrator privilege gain. Well, I don't know if that's good or bad, but at least we see that, there was why was there a lot more from yesterday, and we can start to go ahead and compare there. The other thing we see here is some that were new or gone. So yesterday there were not anything that matched this pattern. Sorry. Today, however, this one existed yesterday, but today it's gone, so it doesn't actually exist. So it's just a good way that we can go ahead and see at a quick glance, this information was from this period of time, and then we can go back to another period of time and look for that same window to see what type of numbers we get and see if there's cause for concern or not. So, cool. So let's go ahead and let's take a little step back. And so let's say all the messages that I've been looking at are messages that have been ingested into Sumo Logic and been processed. And ultimately, I did then have access to go ahead and start to look at that data using the queries, which I think makes sense. But let's say I want to go ahead and start to look at messages in real time. What I can do, similar to a tail -f, is I can go up here. I can go to new live tail. And now I can go ahead and type a somewhat basic query, but I can enter query in here. So I can go ahead and do source category equals labs Apache access. And now when I run this, this is going to look at the logs in real time as they're coming into Sumo Logic, and I'll see these events have occurred. Now, in this case, we're loading demo data, so it's there's not a ton of data, but you can imagine if you have hundreds and thousands of records coming in, per minute, this screen could be flying by pretty quickly. You do have the ability to do some basic querying on here, so I could go ahead and say I want to look for Mozilla. That will work. What you can't do is, for example, say I want to look for specific look for the IP addresses or do calculations on that. The reason being, this is data that really hasn't been ingested or is being ingested into Sumo and hasn't gone through that phase to get those field extraction rules applied. So just to keep that in mind, it's real time. It's not really going to be the I don't think you'll use this very much, but it does give you the ability to monitor live logs in production environment, which is certainly a good thing. So I just wanted to point that out. Let's see. So the last topic I want to go over, which is an important one, is dashboards. Let me go ahead and let me just close a couple windows here, and let's look at dashboards. Actually, let me go back to slides and let me set the table there. I'm going to skip through some of these. So LiveTail we just discussed. Advanced analytics, we looked at some of these, so we didn't actually do predict. The way predict would work is similar to outlier. It's taking the events that have occurred and then using prediction analytics to say, this is the amount of, with the 404s, for example, this is the amount of 404s to expect. So certainly would encourage you to play with these, and the labs will help walk you through here. Log reduce, log compare we discussed already. The log reduce is used to, as we say here, find the needle in the haystack using the pattern recognition or identification. Log compare is going to compare those patterns of today with patterns in the past. Once again, if you were following along or when you go ahead and you do the labs, there will be sections in there that you'll be able to go through and actually do this on your own. And so how can I monitor my data? So dashboards and alerts. So let's go ahead and talk about those. So monitoring dashboards, how do they work? What are they used for? You certainly saw the examples within the demo I did earlier. So each panel is going to represent a single process from a single search. And so your dashboard is going to be made up of panels. So just from a terminology standpoint, dashboard is essentially the entire page. The panels are those portions of the dashboard. You'll be able to drill down into the corresponding query or link to another dashboard. So I showed that in the earlier demo where I was looking at the operational dashboard, and then I drilled into the services dashboard. And so you do have that ability to keep drilling in. The other thing you can do with those panels of the dashboard, as I showed, and I'll probably show an example again, is you can actually look at the query to see what was taking place. So it's a good way to go ahead and jump into looking to see kind of the back end of how that panel was created. You do have a live mode, which is going to provide a live stream of data. Alternatively, you could set it to look at a specific window. So you could say, as it shows here, I want to look at my location of incoming requests for the last 60 minutes. So it just depends on what's appropriate for what you're trying to view. And you can use the dashboards as templates with filters. I'll try and show an example of that. And so you could go ahead and make it easier for your users to create their do queries from a dashboard standpoint or from a dashboard panel standpoint. Rather than doing a query itself. And like I said, I'll show I'll show that because I think it's worth looking at. So let's go ahead and play around with some of the dashboards. Let me go ahead and just jump back into my screen here. And let's go ahead and let's see, do I have any of these still open? Okay, so let's take this one. This is a good one. So I've created this query, and both turned it into a query and took the query and turned it into a map. And so now I have this map, and I like it. I'm proud of the work I did, and I want to share it with my whomever, upper management or with a peer or with a customer, whomever. And so to do so, it's going to be pretty easy to start off. You're going to click Add to Dashboard. When you do so, you're going to go ahead and define the dashboard, or you can use an existing one. So in this case, I'm going to create a new dashboard just for illustrative purposes. So I'm going to call this dashboard, not going to give it a great name, AA123, and I'm going to create a new dashboard. And I'm going to just decide where do I want to save this dashboard in my personal, so using the folder structure. In this case, I'm just going to save it kind of to the root. And so now the panel has been added to my dashboard. And so now I'm looking at this type of view. So what I can do is I now have the ability to edit this dashboard and the panel as well. So let's say maybe I want to make it bigger. I can go ahead and do so. I can go up to some of the more actions in here, and I can play with some of the toggling. So maybe I want to go ahead and change the theme and put it to a dark theme. I can do that. I can go ahead and add a panel. So maybe I want to add a text panel. And call this location, and then I can give it some information. This panel or this whatever dashboard shows good info. Not, and so now that would be in here. And so now once I'm done editing, I can go ahead and start to share this dashboard out. So now I've created this dashboard. It's now saved. Maybe I want to go ahead and give it to an individual. I can go ahead and click on this share icon up here, and I can decide who in the organization I want to share it with. So I can say I want to share it with a specific person. Maybe I want to share it with Bob or Beth, or maybe I want more general and I want to send it to somebody that has the role of analyst. We don't really talk about roles today. That's more of a level 3 thing where we would talk about role-based access controls and setting those up. But basically, you can provide these to specific users or specific roles. And you can also say what they can do. So maybe you only want them to be able to view the dashboard. Maybe you want them to edit it. You also have the ability to go ahead and share this dashboard out with people outside the organization. And so if you want to, and if your organization has allowed it, you can share this with anybody that may be whitelisted. And there's a whitelist that's available in the administrative side, also more of a level 3 thing. Or you could share with anybody in the world. So you could go ahead and say, this dashboard I want to share publicly. Now, you may want to go ahead and limit who you define as public. So maybe you do want to go ahead and whitelist and share it with only people that are coming out of an IP address that is part of your physical location, or you have all those kind of options to choose within there. The other thing I want to show in here is, let me go ahead and actually let me set it up kind of on the fly. So I'm going to go ahead and edit, and this is I want to show filters. So I've gone ahead and I've created this dashboard here. And let's go ahead and look at the query just to kind of remember what we're looking at. So in this case, we're just looking, we're just parsing out the Lab Apache access data, and then or we're just pulling the Lab Apache access data, excuse me, and then we're parsing out IP address. So very straightforward. So this is showing all the visitor locations or all the connections that have occurred over a period of time, which I believe we had in the last 60 minutes or last 15 minutes. But let's say I want to go ahead and make this easier for somebody else to use. And I want to start to look at status codes. So let's say I want to make this, and I really want to just look at the status code for 404s. How am I going to do that? Now I can go back into my query, and I could go ahead and say where status code equals 404. That's one option on how to do this. Another option is I can go to my messages. I can go to status code. Oh, the count. So you need to turn off the count before I can do that. So let me just clean that up a little bit. And then I can go ahead and grab my status code and say, come on, there, 404. And I can do it that way. So that's two different ways that I can go ahead and say specifically I want to use 404s. But I want to show a third way. So let me go ahead and actually let me just close this. I'm just going to go back and reset my screen. There we go. So now here's my query. So let me show you the other way that can be done within the dashboard itself and setting up filters. What I can do is I can go to the top of the screen here, actually I need to click on edit first, click on filters, and I can apply a filter. And I want to apply the filter for status code. So I'm going to look for the filter of status code. There it is. And I'm going to click add. And I'm going to click done editing. So now I'm done. So now let's say I want to go ahead and look for 404s. Type 404, click enter. And the screen is only going to show 404s. And to confirm that, if I go ahead and look in my query, there's the 404. So what I can do with this now is I can share this dashboard with somebody, and even if they don't know the query language, all they need to know is the status code. So they can just say, oh, well, I want to look at 200s now. Sorry, that was covering that. They can just simply type 200, and they can see the different types of status codes. Sorry, I shouldn't have the bracket there. That's why no data is displayed. And so this is a way that you can go ahead and set up these dashboards for somebody. And even if they don't know the data, they don't know the query language, they can still go ahead and use the dashboards and gain or garner relevant information from them. So that's going to be useful. One other thing I want to show you, and then we're going to be, then we'll be close to wrapping up. So let me go ahead and show, let's go back here. So this is going to be true for any query. I'm going to grab this query just because we've been using it, but you can do this for any query. So I've shown you the save as, and I certainly want to show this again because this is going to lead me to something else that's going to be really helpful and more specifically referring to the alerts that I mentioned. We've mentioned a few different times. So we don't want you staring at the dashboard. We don't want you looking at the queries, not nonstop. How's another mechanism to take advantage of Sumo, and that's going to be those alerts. And so let's look at how those alerts are set up. And it's pretty simple. You're going to go to save as. So you're going to create your query, and then you're going to go to save as. And instead of going, or in addition, but instead of saving it, you're going to click schedule the search. And you're going to first decide how frequently do you want this search to run. So how frequently essentially do you want your sets of data? So maybe I want to get this set, I want to get an alert every 15 minutes. So I would choose 15 minutes. Then I'm going to have a bunch of different options here. And I'll go over the alert types first. So how do I want to receive those notifications? Do I want to get an email? And if I get an email, what do I want in that email? Do I want to go ahead and send the histogram, this middle chart over here? Do I want to include the search query in the email? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, depending on the audience, certainly. There's different reasons why you may or may not. Other options, you can go ahead and have a script action run. So maybe once this, every 15 minutes, some sort of service will run. So maybe when you get a bunch of 404s, you want a server to reboot it, and you want a script to run to reboot that server. You could do something like that. ServiceNow. So if you're using ServiceNow and you want to integrate with that, you can very easily and just essentially fill out these field values. And then webhook is really the one I wanted to show. And so this is where you can go ahead and establish a connection with really anything that you will utilize webhook. So Slack, Twitter, although I wouldn't recommend sending you a message out on Twitter that shows your 404s, but you could use any type of webhook environment. The other option that I wanted to point out here is the send notification one. Let me just set the email just there we go. So I can have this occur every time a search is complete. So let's say every 15 minutes this search is going to run and it's going to send me all these results, and that's fine. But maybe I want to only receive a notification when a condition is met. So maybe I only want to know when there's been a certain amount of 404s. And if I'm under that amount of 404s, I don't really care, because that's it's under my threshold, and it's a good thing. So I don't need to be notified of it. But maybe you need to be notified when you hit 100 404s, or when you hit some sort of ratio between 404s and 200s or something like that. That can be all configured for you as well, or you can configure that yourself rather. But it can be configured in the environment. So let's see. Let's go back to the slide deck and kind of wrap up here today. And I'll open up to questions. If you want to go ahead and type a question in, that's cool. Otherwise, I'll try and or just open it up, and you guys can ask questions. But let's see. Sorry about that noise. There we go. So monitoring alerts. We just looked at that, and these are just some examples. The hands-on lab, as mentioned, is I would certainly encourage you guys to go through these processes and actually do the work yourself to get the hands-on experience. Metrics, I'm not going to really cover metrics too much right now. We looked at it earlier, and so with the metrics, we went ahead and when we did the demo earlier, we were using the metrics to combine to see, well, to see what was going on. And then we were able to go ahead and use that overlay, as we see here, where we were looking at both metrics and we were looking at logs at the same time, and using that overlay to correlate the metrics to the relevant logs, and ultimately use the logs to then identify why things were happening. Ingesting metric sources, kind of this quick summation of this slide is there's a bunch of different ways to ingest your data into Sumo Logic for metrics, similar to the way that there's a bunch of different ways to do it using your logs. And like I said earlier, those would be covered typically in level 3. So just wanted to kind of highlight that you can do it, but I'm not going to go over the specifics on setting that up right now. And then metrics, dashboards, and alerts. So I've shown log metrics, excuse me, log alerts, log dashboards. Metrics also have a similar component, and we saw the example of those in the demo I did earlier, where we were looking at the top right panel of CPU usage was an example of a dashboard panel, or a metrics panel rather, excuse me. And then the metrics alert was demonstrated through the Slack message I received at the beginning. So where do I go from here? So you've sat through today. What are the next steps? Technical resources. So when you first log into Sumo Logic, you'll be brought to that home page that you saw earlier. There's also a Learn tab, and the Learn tab is going to have a bunch of great resources. All the ones that are listed here. So there's going to be access to the tutorials, which essentially I pretty much went through this one here, the using Sumo Logic tutorial, but would encourage you to do so. You'll have reference to technical documentation, shortcuts to cheat sheets, which are going to be really helpful to look at the operators, so you can see a whole list of all the operators and then decide what makes sense for you to use. The ability to go ahead and oops, sorry about that. To go ahead and ask support, for example, or I would encourage you to certainly join the community forum. That's going to be a great place to post questions and find answers and interact with other Sumo Logic users and discuss your use case. And oftentimes, other organizations are using doing a similar use case, and kind of bounce ideas back and forth off each other. Let's see. So I'll go ahead and open it up to questions. Let me go ahead and try to unmute you guys. Let's see.